Hi everyone, Susan Corbett, custom machine quilter. Here I'm going to talk to you today about this ambitious quilt. It started out life as a kit from a quilt store here in Texas. It depicts a Lone Star flag, the flag of Texas. Most of the quilt is what you see here: piecing, a rail fence, some little squares sewn together. That Lone Star there is fused on. I would have done Trapunto, except with the fuse, I couldn't really hope to get much out of it. In the background of that blue field, I picked up a meander. I cross-hatched the red parts, and in all that remaining white space, it's a bunch of triangles in two different white tone-on-tone fabrics. That's where I went to town with all these motifs. The kit, the sample had a few things trapuntoed on here, but it's so much space. Oh my gosh. The whole quilt is 96 inches by 64 inches. And I don't know the dimensions of the white space, but it was a lot. So my client and I got together and made a list of his favorite motifs and what he wanted on there. He thought we were having too many. I thought we didn't have enough because I know how much space there is here to fill. So how did we get to this finished product? I started out with my huge file of Texas motifs. It just goes on and on and on. We've got bluebonnets, a mockingbird, the state bird, a big longhorn, armadillo, a cowboy, a windmill, the shape of Texas, a yellow rose, and the Alamo. So I've done enough Texas quilts to have amassed this collection. But I added a few more examples of these motifs this time around because, like the longhorn in particular, just didn't seem like it was going to be adequate. I needed a better drawing. So I went on Etsy and I bought a few designs. Well, most especially that armadillo there. So the first part is which motifs do you want to use, how many, and then figuring out where they wanted to go. I decided to make vignettes, like a handful of snapshots. So it's not one big picture, it's a bunch of different scenes put together. I did quite a bit of planning here, but I didn't plan the whole thing out. A whole bunch of it is still, it came together organically. So I wanted to have some main character motifs and then some supporting character motifs. And here are various line drawings. I decided sort of how big I wanted them to be. Here's a couple of books that some of these designs came from. And then I went to a copy store and enlarged or reduced as needed. I reversed some of the images. Like I'd flip one over on its back and retrace the back of it so I could have two different versions. Then the first part of Trapunto is you sew high loft batting to the top, just those two pieces. And then you trim around the motif. You cut away the part that will not be Trapunto. And normally I would do this, I would stitch with water-soluble thread, which means it's thread that dissolves in water. So once the quilt is totally finished, then you wash the quilt and that top layer of thread goes away. This is a wall hanging. This is for a man who doesn't sew at all. So I knew he wasn't going to wash this quilt. So instead I stitched with clear thread. So after I got those motifs put in and then cut, then I layered the top and batting and backing as usual and began quilting. So the Trapunto bat is a high loft polyester. The bat we used inside is a 100% cotton, which isn't very lofty, but it's not completely flat. It's not thin. It's like about the consistency of a warm and natural. And he brought that to me, so I don't know what brand or it was or any of those details. So since this quilt will be up on a wall, it's not going to be one that anyone looks at up close and personal, like a throw. So just to make sure those motifs were going to show up good and well, we opted to quilt in a contrasting thread. Here, that little circle means Fort Worth. That's where Randy's from, and he wanted to accentuate that, so that's why we put that detail in there. So I used a beige thread, yellow for the rows, and that was quilted in a jean stitch thread, so it's really thick and dark. I used green and blue for the flowers, and gray for like the armadillo. So not real heavy on the color, just enough so that it doesn't look like it's all white. And so here, at this point, the motifs are starting to come to life. You can tell where they've been quilted before with the clear thread, and now I'm quilting over those lines with colored thread, and I'm still relying on my laser light for placement of the design. It shifted a lot in the initial quilt, and I want to make sure, I know what I'm doing. It was kind of hard to see in some places. That first pass of quilting was not real precise, and this part needs to be pretty accurate. So I've got my paper pattern up there for reference. I was concerned how this was going to turn out because the armadillo we have here in Texas has 9 rings in the middle of his body, and they're pretty close together. And I didn't want to put 9 rings in there because I didn't want to squash him in the middle and then have his huge bulk up around his shoulders. And when I explained that to Randy, he's like, no, I want 9 rings. I want it to be accurate. So I put 9 rings in there. But I love this part because there's been a lot of work in here so far, but this is when you start to get some payoff, when you can start to see what you're getting here. One quick note, with all the piecing in here, I really don't like it when there's piecing lines that get in the way of my motif. What you don't quilt down sticks right up, and I don't want a seam to be the thing that sticks up. But there wasn't any way around it on this quilt because there are seams everywhere. And one thing those seams have in their favor is the seam allowance. That only accentuates the Trapunto effect. So in a way, that's kind of good. I was taking my time here because now I'm about to put those rings in. And one benefit of this being a wall quilt that you aren't going to see close up is I felt no pressure for everything to be really perfect. It just needs to be easily recognizable from afar. And being a Texas quilt, you want it to be kind of rustic, or at least I did. So everything is going to look like a sketch, not like a painting or a photo. So one of the things that makes Trapunto, well, among the ingredients are high loft batting. Your design needs to be large enough that it's worth it to do all that work. I did not Trapunto all those bluebonnets because that would have been a wasted effort. But this guy is really going to stand out. It looks really good. And then you accentuate all that bulk with dense background quilting that surrounds these motifs. Here I'm adding a few details to his face. Almost done. And then off in the background behind the armadillo, I've added a cactus. To get that, see, whenever you're making pictures, you've got to consider scale, how far in the background something is going to look like. And then what to do with the background quilting to really sell that idea. So between the cactus and the armadillo, I loosened up the background quilting, so that's kind of an indication that there's a change in topography or something to manage that transition better, which was one of the big challenges of this quilt. So here in the lower left-hand side of this white panel, I'm working on a cowboy on a horse. And what these two motifs have in common, the cowboy and the armadillo, is their backgrounds are quite similar, with the Alamo in between. So in the background of the cowboy is a great big tall windmill. And they're not perfectly to scale. You know, in quilting we take all kinds of liberties. We'll suspend our disbelief to get whatever motif is going to fit without being pictorially accurate. The woman who designed this motif can just quilt it all in one line without, you know, making all these little stops and breaks and everything. She's a true artist, and I do not have her gift. So I'm so grateful for her patterns. But I love the way it's coming together. Sorry about the focus problems here. I bought a new gizmo to help me, record these kind of close-ups, and I'm still working the kinks out of it. And there's the finished guy. Now we move on to some background quilting. So at this point, all right, the background quilting around him is a bunch of ground meandering. Really, in its most basic form, it's like a zigzag. It's extremely close together lines. They're jagged, they're uneven. What we're doing is implying ground and some depth. And adding some little weeds and plants and such to keep it from being too static. It's extremely close right around the motif to get that motif to puff up as much as it will. I'm adding, rocks and weeds and some little slight changes into topography. It's right around this part where the voice of doubt really pops up. I assumed years and years ago, that those doubts would go away, and they really don't. The more of a comfort zone you develop machine quilting, the more confident you feel, for sure. But when you're really stepping out of your comfort zone, making up a scene as I go along, as I say, I'm using motifs that artists have drawn. I myself got my art degree from nowhere at all. I read books, I look at pictures, but I don't have any artistic training. So every once in a while I get a real attack of imposter syndrome. And I have to remind myself, that's not real. This is going to be fine. I've done this numerous times. It worked before, it's going to work now. If it's really terrible, I can rip it out and do it over again. But I bet it's just going to be fine. But this time, the imposter syndrome really took hold and wouldn't let go for the longest time. It was quite a while before I could snap out of it. And the reassuring factor here is this is not a show quilt. It's not going to be in any quilt show. I have a judge of one. I have my client. And he's not a quilter. And in the end, he loved it. When he came to pick it up, he was thrilled. He said, "You have done it." So that's the only voice I have to impress. And we're our own worst critics. But a good thing to learn is how to encourage yourself as you go, and not how to beat your inner artist up. I'm a huge proponent of the book, The Artist's Way, that I recommend highly to any and everybody, whether you consider yourself an artist or not. And Julia Cameron, the author, says, think how many great pieces of music were thrown in the fire and burned that no one will ever get to hear because the composer decided it was terrible and that he had no talent. So I'm not saying this is great and that it's wonderful, but it's not worthless either. It felt awkward in the moment, but in the end, it was just fine. What I aim to do here is to suggest a scene, not depict one with tremendous accuracy. So all of this I'm putting in here is just wild countryside. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to suggest that rugged Texas landscape. So these little vertical lines are meant to imply vegetation of some sort, some kind of plants, weeds, whatever, brush. Here I'm managing the fullness, which is always a thing I have to deal with in machine quilting. When you quilt densely over here, you get more fullness over there, so that needs to get brought under control somehow, which is a good reason to stabilize a quilt. This part of the quilt didn't really get stabilized beyond the main motifs. So I used pins and hopped around to really quilt down the areas that were billowing the most. It's also a really good idea to stop and assess and take a break, go for a little walk or something before resuming. And just because I'm doing Trapunto, it does not mean all the background has to be squashed. All kinds of places don't have to be quilted really densely. And I hear asked all the time, how do you know how big to make something? How dense, how big? Well, your background needs to be smaller than the motif it surrounds. How much smaller, I suppose, is a matter of opinion. The smaller the motif, the more it looks like it's way off in the background. The larger your background fill, the more attention it will call attention to itself. So ironically, when you want the background to look like empty space, then that's when you really want to put in a very dense, small background fill. If I wanted that ground to appear closer to the foreground, then it would need to be bigger and way off in the distance. If I want it to look smaller, then it needs to be really, really smaller. One word about that windmill. I thought way after the fact, a windmill is not something you want a trapunto because it's a spindly set of stick-like structure. But I left it the way it was, and it worked out fine. Okay, so I've got my main motifs, and then I need some supporting motifs, some little space fillers, so I'm not clogging the whole thing up with motif. Like in a Christmas quilt, you want to fill in with holly or something. Well, here on a Texas quilt, stars are the obvious answer. I put 2 great big stars in some large empty spaces. And these little stars are going to help me manage the transition from one vignette to another. So I'm doing groupings of stars to take up space. They're appropriate. And they're going to fix it to where the whole thing isn't just a bunch of squashed ground meandering. That would be boring. When you've got a great big space to fill and all you do is one background, that is really boring. So this keeps it from being too static and empty. So I've got this acrylic star template here. So I don't have to mark it, because I did no marking on this quilt whatsoever. I knew there was no chance of getting the markings out. So this template really helps a whole lot. And figuring out how they're going to nestle together, what angle, what direction, where the points are going to go, that's a thing I work out on the fly. I like to position the middle of that star where there are no seams. Good luck with that. I don't think making these stars is especially fun. It's a little tricky, but the payoff, I think, is tremendous. So I think 3 of those together is plenty. And then I can move to closing up the gaps with more ground meandering. And it's wonderful to leave space in between the meandering that's up against the star and what I've done before around that horse. That little bit of empty negative space looks really good. In the very small spaces, I like to reduce the machine speed and then speed it back up again in the larger spaces so I can really go to town. And then this back and forth zigzag, if your machine is not stitch regulated and mine isn't, then I really need to watch my stitch length and keep it consistent. This will use up quite a bit of thread, as you might imagine. This is fun to do. I feel no pressure to do it perfectly. That's, perfect is beside the point here. I can go back and forth as I need to. And then I filled in between and underneath the Alamo with a bunch of Greek keys. And those are freehanded as well. There's the rose in all of its jean stitch glory. I did vertical matchstick quilting behind that longhorn. Here's a look at the back of the quilt, which is a picture in its own right. Too bad the back of the quilt won't ever show, but whatever. One last thing to mention before I go is those radiating lines were a device to break up these vignettes. That idea just popped into my head, and I love the way it looks. I think that's really effective. So I hope y'all enjoyed seeing this. I wish you courage and bravery to go forth and do some of this on your own, because who knows what we can come up with. Imagination is a really delightful thing. And my client was very happy with the way this turned out. So thanks so much for watching. If you liked it, please like the video. And I will talk to you next time.